My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Wednesday, March 6th. This is the 152nd day since the October 7th attacks. Today, I had another meeting at the White House for a couple of hours. I attended an interfaith meeting with a very small number of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, many of whom are committed to a comprehensive ceasefire. You know, it's my understanding that this was one of the first meetings that was talking about Gaza specifically. And in this moment, you know, emotions are running high for people from different religious communities. Understandably, communities of faith are deeply invested. Many people, certainly in Palestine, even in my community, the Christian community, we know people. We have friends who are directly connected. You know, one of my dear friends lost 2 family members. And I know people also in Israel who, I'm one person removed from hostages. I'm one person removed from people who died in the October 7th attacks. I'm one person removed from people who've been killed in Gaza. And that's true for Palestinians who've lost loved ones in Gaza, and for many Israelis who either know hostages or know people who were killed on October 7th. One of the challenges in this moment is that communities are, even still, this was true in October, there's such a difficulty in having any empathy across these divisions. And maybe it's unfair to expect it. You know, I was speaking to a Jewish leader in the fall, and they said to me, it's unfair to ask people to have empathy for one another, but that's where we need to lean on human rights and international law. We need to lean into these other principles. But I believe as Christians, I mean, certainly the foundational principles of our faith, if it's not empathy, when we talk about the love of Christ, we talk about the love of neighbor, let alone enemy. And so what's it mean to practice our faith in the midst of this moment? If it's not empathy or love or compassion, let alone the practice of justice, right? What's it mean to have constructive conversations that can help move the needle forward so that people stop dying? And so, you know, our call is for a comprehensive ceasefire so that deaths in Gaza might be brought to an end. So those 100 lives of hostages, if 100 of them are still alive, that they might be returned home to their families. I'm not able to give a readout of the White House meeting. It was off the record. I can say, not from the direct political conversations, but one of the things I left the meeting with, I was encouraged by the faith leaders in the room. We didn't all agree. But I will say we cut through the rhetoric. We did have some very honest and very hard conversations. We did press hard. May God hear our cry, and might it move this administration and our president. We're diligently asking the question, what's it going to take to move forward? The U.S. Has a critical role to play, and may we stop being an impediment. May we stop being complicit. One of the things I clearly communicated to the White House today, and we've said this pretty regularly in some of our other meetings with Churches for Middle East Peace, you know, the organization I lead. You know, I often tell the story chronologically, you know, in the United States and certainly in the political conversation and in the media. The conversation starts with October 7th, you know, and I'll start there just as a way to tell the story, but the October 7th attacks by Hamas, they were beyond horrific. It was a massacre. And it's true that the scale of death and the atrocities that were committed on that day upon Jewish Israelis and internationals, you know, it's unparalleled in the Jewish community in Israel and around the world since the Second World War, since the Holocaust. And friends, I'm not just saying this as a talking point, and I think it's really important. You know, my Palestinian friends have heard me say this. You know, for those who are advocating for justice and liberation for Palestinians, I'm not saying this as propaganda. You know, I watched the videos from that day. 1,200 people, men, women, and children, were brutally and systematically killed. It was a massacre, and I believe grieving their loss, showing empathy towards those who buried their dead, is not betraying the liberation movement for Palestine. That showing love and kindness and respect for humanity, that condemning the horrors of that day, which should be condemned, that actually strengthens the argument on behalf of justice for Palestinians. And October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. And conversations about what's happening right now can't be had without talking about the fact that there was not a ceasefire, you know, prior to October 7th, that the historic trauma of decades of systemic control and oppression and occupation and military suppression, oppression of the Palestinian population in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza through occupation and other means has to be addressed. and that Gaza was experiencing a devastating humanitarian crisis prior to water, gas, and electricity being cut off in early October after the attacks. And so while I do believe absolutely we should show empathy and that we should stand in solidarity with the Jewish community when they're calling for the release of the hostages, that still remain in Gaza, we cannot ignore the ongoing slaughter of Palestinian civilians by bombs and the daily ground incursion that says its goal is the eradication of Hamas, but instead is indiscriminately killing, an average of 100 Palestinians a day. And I think many people believe we have to start with that story because it's the most acute in this moment right now. That to ignore what the International Criminal Court is saying absolutely could be a genocide is putting our heads in the sand. And not only that, our government is complicit. That many of the weapons being used, say made in the USA. And our Palestinian friends rightly challenge us. Why does the story have to start with October 7th? When their people, their aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, cousins are suffocating under the rubble. I heard a story today that was so horrific that there are still so many bodies left behind and the animals have no food to eat. There's little grass left, that livestock can't find food, and that some of them are living off of the flesh of bodies that have been left behind. And that there's not resources to get all of the bodies that are left in the rubble out, that they're still trapped under stone. God have mercy. When the White House and Biden administration talk about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that really feels like it's ignoring the reality of what's happening there. This is not a humanitarian crisis. Let's be honest. Let's really talk about what's happening in Gaza. Not only is it not a humanitarian crisis, this is a man-made crisis that responsibility has to be taken, certainly by the Israeli government, but also by the American government. And that's part of what we talked about today. And we've been saying if you can't stop the violence for the sake of Palestinians, there's a moral argument to be made. We have to have moral courage. There's also a pragmatic argument. It is in the best interest, not only of Palestinians, but also of Israelis to call for a comprehensive ceasefire. And it's also in the best interest of the United States. So there's a political argument to be made. There's a pragmatic argument to be made. One of the effects every day that goes on, not only are more and more people dying, but there is also more and more hatred against the perpetrators of the violence and against those who are supporting it. And so we will have larger and larger problems in the future if we don't stop this immediately. And so those are some of the things that were raised today in the meetings that we had. The death toll today in Gaza is at 30,717 people. The injury toll in Gaza is at 72,156 people injured. This is not only inhumane, this is unconscionable. Every day, also, increasingly, children, men and women will increasingly die from hunger. We've seen those numbers start to rise. Those will rise increasingly if the issue of immediate and adequate aid is not addressed. And we get quite frustrated when we keep having conversations with administrative officials about that because immediate and adequate humanitarian aid, is not possible because of the ongoing fighting. Yesterday, Al Jazeera reported that Palestinians seeking aid were attacked by Israeli forces yet again. So this is the second time this has happened. Israeli forces, this is Al Jazeera, said that they have once again opened fire on desperate Palestinians seeking aid from a supply convoy entering Gaza City. This is the second such attack since last Thursday. This is about a week ago, which is now being called the Flower Massacre, where at least 117 people were killed, more than 700 people were injured in that incident. That was where people were seeking aid. Israelis opened fire, and there was also a stampede. That was a massacre. The World Food Program also said they had a 14-truck food convoy that was turned back by the Israeli Defense Forces after a 3-hour wait at the Wadi Gaza checkpoint. And there is no tipping point yet on the possibility of a temporary ceasefire. It was reported if an agreement is reached, it will be for 6 weeks. The hope is that 6 weeks will allow for the next phases to be agreed upon. A 6-week ceasefire, this is from Haaretz, would be possible if Hamas agrees to the sick, the wounded, the elderly, and the women hostages. The White House said after the U.S. National Security Counselor Jake Sullivan met with Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed al-Tahini. So there is much work to be done. May God go before us in our efforts. May we have wisdom, moral courage. May we learn together. May hatred be removed from our hearts. May we have empathy, but not only that, may our hearts be broken so that we might be motivated and compelled to call for an end to all violence, and to work together constructively toward peace.